Hi everyone, my name is Jad, and thank you for checking out my slideshow about unpacking a standard. My slideshow today is going to talk about the grades that I'm interested in teaching, particularly middle school, and then even more particularly 8th grade social studies. So I'll go ahead and begin and talk about my unit plan that I selected for this. I tried to pick one particular unit, something that would encompass about 5 lessons. And like I said before, social studies is the subject, particularly 20th century American history. The topic that I selected was the Great Depression. I picked this one because it's material that I haven't covered before, but I'm interested in pursuing this subject and this topic for my clinical. And so, by and large, it would encompass the economic, political, social, and cultural changes that took place in America during the era of the Great Depression. For the standards that I selected, I used the CCSS, Common Core State Standards, for middle school and 8th grade. I focused particularly on ELA literacy within the subsection of history and social studies classes. My guiding questions for this activity: what can the economic crisis known as the Great Depression tell us about life in the United States? When students are thinking about this question, they're going to hopefully have that in mind as they complete their activities of why am I doing research about this particular famous individual? Well, it's because we want to know what impact it had. The second question asks the same thing. What are some lasting social and cultural impacts? The students should be able to use that as a guiding post, something that they can always look towards of, we're doing this activity because we're trying to solve this question. And the last question is also a way to make this subject a little bit more global and a little bit more timely, to ask the question, with nearly 100 years separating our time from the Great Depression, what are some similarities and differences between then and now? I think this is a good way for students to put themselves into the context of historical study and historical inquiry, while also developing the skills that they'll need to pursue other questions of the same sort. For my grade level standards, these are the two standards that I wanted to begin with, and they could be specifically the only standards that I cover for this unit. It was CCSS ELA Literacy RH 6 through 8.9. Analyze the relationship between a primary and secondary source on the same topic. I'll go into a little bit more detail in just a minute. And then the second standard that I'm going to assess the students on is 6 through 8.6. Identify aspects of a text that reveal an author's point of view or purpose through analyzing language. I selected these because they are some skills that the students would have also developed during an ELA class, but also because, given informative nature of texts in history classes, and given some complexities that reveal themselves in different ways when searching for information and searching for data in a classroom, as well as presenting that data, these two skills usually go hand in hand. So I'll quickly explain how I interpreted those two standards. The first standard I interpreted as, by the end of this lesson, students will be able to analyze 2 different texts from the same time period and identify which sources are primary and which are secondary, using a criteria developed in class. In this way, students and the teacher will agree on how to assess texts, and with that expectation in mind, they can then feel a little bit more confident having developed the standards themselves, which are then proof-checked by the teacher to make sure that the criteria make sense. And the second standard I interpreted as, by the end of this lesson, students will have developed the ability to identify language that reveals an author's bias or point of view in line with the main ideas presented in the text. This one is a little bit just more close reading skill assessment. Have the students examine the text for its nuances, not simply understanding, is this primary or secondary? So you can see that these two standards build on each other, which is why I put them in this order. And again, sort of a way for students to orient themselves in this class, in this unit, is through examining authentic resources and learning about the lives of famous individuals that lived during the Great Depression. Students will gain insight into the historical period. This is a foreshadowing of what the project that I've designed for this unit. For lesson 1, we practice the skill, and it comes in 3 different components. We read the course material within the context of the learning goal, which I've already outlined. We identify the author, audience, and main idea, and we analyze the point of view, bias, and tone So with a little bit of pre-teaching for this activity and looking at different examples, students will begin the unit by examining primary sources. We determine the qualities of the text. We examine a secondary source. We examine how it's different. And then, we understand in the end that both are useful for learning, but they're not equal. They provide us with different insights. The way that we can possibly assess students for understanding these skills and practicing these skills is, going into just a very general look at this activity. We could design Kahoot themed activities to review what the students have gained in terms of skills or in terms of the content that they've seen. We can have students work collaboratively to create mind maps, to identify primary and secondary traits of texts. We can go with true or false hand raises in the class to incorporate everybody and to kind of gauge generally how students are responding to instruction and possibly modify that as we go. And then we can also do that through small group work, which is reading through short documents and sorting them into primary, secondary categories. You can do this, again and again until you can understand which students are able to do this independently and which students continue to need help. And in line with this standard, students develop a criteria, as I said before, and they agree on it with the teacher and they agree on it with their peers, and this will help them determine this primary skill that we're looking at. Lesson number 2, or 2/3 that could be extended, is that you want to help students understand the purpose of this skill in the context more deeply into the Great Depression. So they understand the differences between primary and secondary texts. Students are also learning now the skill in the context of the Great Depression. They can see the view of what the project is that's going to really assess their skills. So project number 1, the students will select one important figure in society during the Great Depression in the United States and conduct some independent research. They go through a database that's been presented to them and they pick one primary source and one secondary source, and they simply can annotate it. So they'll find information about who, what, where, when, and why. They don't have to write or compose anything. They just need to find the document, bring it into class for the next day. Now, after they've completed this activity, another standard appears, and I think that this is an important one because it gets them to understand the purpose of the goal of the project and of the main question. What can we know? What can we learn about the Great Depression? This standard, 6 through 8.1, is cite specific textual evidence to support analysis of primary and secondary sources. So we have learned that these sources are not equal, but they provide us with different types of insights. The students will now learn how to use that in a productive method. So in this one, we look at a project that asks us to review and present the information. We check that students have one primary source, one secondary source, and that the information that they've gathered is relevant. If they haven't, they repeat this step. When they're ready to move on, it's time to create the larger assessment for presentation. This can also still be a formative assessment as a part of a larger unit. So students have already collected the information. Now they work individually or in pairs to consider, what does this information reveal about the selected historical individual? Can you cite specific work? And now they can complete a Canva profile poster of this famous individual. We give them an example in class. We can kind of show them someone at that time period that was very famous and that can help understand what type of text or quotations that they might use, what type of images that they might use, what type of who, what, where, when, why information that they might use, given in mind that they need to use one primary and one secondary source. They follow the model. Hopefully, by the end, a proficient student will be able to convey and provide a strong presentation on this person's life, and a secondary source will also provide a slightly different angle, giving a little bit more context historically. The big ideas of this entire unit, essentially, is that by the end of this project, students will understand how to use sources and what sources are. They'll understand the ideas that they need to convey. They understand the differences between subject and topic. They understand that ideas convey specific, sometimes loaded points of view. And they understand how to back up their claims, how to incorporate analysis into posters, and how to convey different source material by integrating that into their own presentations. That's all I've got. Thank you so much for giving me your time today.